Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a very special five-part podcast series on the Hughes Hubbard Reed Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert, which was recently released. In this five-part podcast series, we take a look at five separate areas that are touched upon in the alert. They include an overview of the alert, the U.S. FCPA component, the French developments in anti-bribery, anti-corruption, enforcement, and compliance programs, multilateral development banks and their role in the fight against bribery and corruption, and we conclude with a review of anti-bribery enforcement in Brazil, along with Brazilian authorities' embracement of compliance. The alert is a significant piece of research, but more importantly than simply listing cases, it gives you a deep dive into the analysis of both anti-bribery, anti-corruption enforcement, but also policy announcements by regulators and other commentary from countries outside the United States about the state of compliance and where it's going forward. In this part 3, I visit with partner Bryan Sillaman, who's also the managing partner of the firm's Paris office, on developments in France over the past year. This special series on the Hughes Hubbard Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert has been a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode in our exploration of the Hughes Hubbard FCPA 2019 Alert. Today, I have with me Bryan Sillaman. Bryan is a partner at Hughes Hubbard, and he's also the managing partner in the Paris office. So, Bryan, first of all, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bryan, I had the privilege to come to France this past summer to speak at a compliance event, and it struck me that France is evolving as fast, perhaps, as any other country in both anti-corruption investigation and enforcement and compliance. And in many ways is moved to the forefront because of a variety of factors. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the developments in anti-corruption enforcement in France this year and what you've seen in terms of the really first significant Sanctions Commission enforcement action. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. And, I completely agree with your assessment. It's amazing to see how quickly the market and the environment here has shifted over the past couple of years. And I think we saw in 2019 some really significant activity and the manifestation really of the implementation and the adoption of SAP-ANDU, which came into force about 3 years ago, the end of 2016. And one of the really interesting developments was the first decision issued by the Sanctions Commission of the AFA. So just as a bit of a reminder, the AFA was an agency created out of SAP-ANDU. So it's fairly new. It's the Agence Française Anti-Corruption. And it has within its scope of activity the right to conduct controls on companies that are subject to SAP-ANDU. And these controls are essentially to assess whether the companies have implemented the elements of an effective compliance program that are required under the SAP-ANDU legislation. To the extent that the AFA believes that they have not done so, it can bring sanctions against those companies, which ultimately are decided before a commission, the Sanctions Commission. And we saw the first of those cases this year in July 2019. To give you a bit of detail on it, it involved a company that was reported publicly at Sonepar. And AFA took issue with a number of elements of the company's compliance program, asserting that they did not have in place a code of conduct, that they hadn't conducted effective due diligence, that they did not have a robust anti-corruption risk mapping. And so all of these were used as the AFA's bases for bringing sanctions against this company. The company, of course, contested these various observations, and ultimately the Sanctions Commission sided with the company and decided that at the time of the sanctions hearing, Sonepar had in fact adopted elements of a compliance program that were considered to be effective under SAP-UNDO.
And what was the final result that compliance practice, or I guess perhaps the lessons compliance practitioners should take away from that, Bryan?
Yeah, I think there are a few. You know, on the one hand, it shows that the AFA is willing to bring companies before the Sanctions Commission, is willing to pursue sanctions when they believe that companies have not adopted elements of a compliance program as required under SAP-UNDO. But another key takeaway, I think, is that the AFA has released guidelines on how they believe that companies should go about adopting and implementing the elements of a compliance program under the law. And those guidelines contain fairly detailed recommendations, for example, on how companies should conduct their anti-corruption risk mappings. What the Sanctions Commission determined is that while those guidelines may be used as helpful guidance for companies, they are not themselves legally binding. And so there is discretion, there is some flexibility in how companies go about implementing their compliance programs, as long as they're done in good faith and with a good faith view of prohibiting corruption.
Bryan, if I could turn now to a little bit different focus, which is the French equivalent of deferred prosecution agreements. Sitting here in the United States, it seemed to me this was I don't want to say dramatic development, but at least a development that went in a little bit different direction from what we'd previously seen from French jurisprudence. Could you talk about the development of this strategy and how prosecutors might use it going forward?
Absolutely, and I think you're right that it is a pretty dramatic development. The CJIP, which is the Convention Judiciaire d'Intérêt Public, and as you say, is the sort of most closely associated with a DPA, was pretty hotly contested during the passage of SAP-UNDO. There was a lot of debate as to whether this type of mechanism was consistent with French law, was consistent with French practice, but it ultimately did come into force and has been used on 7 or 8 occasions involving companies that have engaged not just in corruption, but also tax evasion or money laundering associated with tax evasion offenses. What's really interesting this year is that the French prosecutors and the AFA have issued guidelines on the implementation of the CJIP process. And what these guidelines are intended to do is to provide clarity on the circumstances when companies will be eligible to receive this type of transaction. So it is discretionary. It ultimately comes down to a decision of the prosecutors as to whether they feel that a company warrants resolution of offenses through a CJIP. But to see the French authorities issue guidance like this is quite, in my view, a sea change from the atmosphere and the attitude towards cooperation with regulators or with enforcement agencies that existed several years ago.
Bryan, I really don't know you very well, but when I hear lawyers use words like game changer and sea change, as a lawyer, that communicates to me it's really a very dramatic change. So I was wondering if you might give us a few thoughts of why you thought either the French legislature or the French judiciary or prosecutors would be willing to make this really dramatic change. Is it something along the lines of trying to engender more cooperation with defendants, or corporations rather? Is it trying to really come into line with other national anti-corruption regimes such as Clean Companies Act in Brazil, the UK Bribery Act, or even the FCPA? Is there something else going on?
Yeah, I think there are a few elements in play. France, like a number of other countries, as a signatory to the OECD convention, was criticized in past years for not doing enough on the enforcement front. France has had a law prohibiting corruption since the early 2000s, but was seen as not doing enough on the enforcement side. And we saw here in France a number of large French companies pursued by the U.S. authorities and entered into deferred prosecution agreements or other resolutions by the U.S. authorities. And I think there was a view here within the French legal community and the French prosecutors that French prosecutors should be the ones doing the enforcement and focusing on the enforcement of traditionally, quote unquote, French companies, large French groups that are headquartered here. To do that, I think there was a recognition that there needed to be a new mechanism for engaging with companies and for offering the opportunity of resolving things in a more efficient fashion than had been the case historically. And so that's why I think there was significant debate around whether this type of legal mechanism was the right way to do that. I think the idea is that it will give more control back into the hands of French prosecutors and allow them to be more active in enforcing anti-corruption laws vis-a-vis French and potentially non-French companies.
Bryan, for our final point, I wanted to take things in a little bit different direction. And if I could introduce this next question with the following. We had a U.S. court case this summer where individuals were prosecuted under the FCPA, and the court found that the internal investigation was done at the behest of and at the direction of the U.S. Department of Justice, even though lawyers in private law firm had been hired by the company to do this internal investigation. And that set off a kind of an interesting debate here in the United States. And in studying the commentary on that, one of the commentators raised the point that this implicated international blocking statutes, and more specifically the French blocking statute. And that led me to discover there was a French blocking statute. And it seems to me that now has gained greater importance. So I wanted to ask you, with your perspective sitting in Paris, what might revival of the French blocking statute mean for international anti-corruption investigations and enforcement?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It has been a topic of interest here. And, the blocking statute has existed here for many years. It was first implemented in 1968, actually, but has not been enforced frequently at all. There are only one or two cases involving individuals who have been pursued for violations of the blocking statute, although it is a criminal statute. Essentially, the idea behind it was to control the provision of information, either sensitive information that would affect French interests or information that was being provided to foreign law enforcement agencies. And the idea being that it's not necessarily illegal or prohibited to provide such information, but that it should go through the MLAT process, the Mutually Legal Assistance Treaty process, and through defined channels so that French authorities could opine on whether such information should be provided to foreign authorities. There's been a lot of focus on whether it is effective, and this goes to a broader view here that the U.S., but maybe not just the U.S., but primarily has taken a very broad extraterritorial approach in enforcing not just the anti-corruption laws, but also the sanctions legislation. And so there's been talk about increasing the sanctions for violations of the blocking statute, also making it more clear what exactly falls within the blocking statute and when violations would be found, and making a mandatory reporting obligation to a French agency when requests were made for information. And so if those enhancements are passed, and they have not been yet, it could significantly impact the way that companies conduct their internal investigations, particularly here in France or involving French individuals, among other things, and having to make a mandatory reporting to a French agency about requests for information, which could in turn prompt French authorities to begin investigations.
Bryan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but I've been visiting today with Bryan Sillaman, the managing partner for Hughes Hubbard Paris office and a partner at the firm. We've been looking at some of the key developments in anti-corruption investigations and enforcement in France for 2019, all wrapped around the Hughes Hubbard 2019 FCPA alert. Bryan, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode in our special 5-part podcast series on the Hughes Hubbard Fall 2019 FCPA and Anti-Bribery Alert. I've linked to it in the show notes, and I would urge you to check it out, download it, and read it at your leisure. There's lots packed into it. And of course, best of all is the price, which is it's free. The series has been a presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.